Modern slavery. Yes, it exists, and it affects each and every one of us, no matter what country you live in. If your country issues bonds, then you are a slave, a subject, a serf. Whatever word or term you want to use to describe it, think about what a bond is. Most people have at least heard that word or that term tossed around at least a few times in their life, whether it was their parents that bought them, right? Or, maybe grandparents or others. They've at least heard this, or on the news, or from those who talk about investments and stuff. But most Canadians have at least heard of the term bonds, although they don't really understand what it means. You buy a bond, you get a return rate of interest, and hopefully it's above inflation so that you actually make a genuine return on it. Although nowadays that's the thing. Bonds today have negative yields for the most part. Even the ones that don't go into negative territory. Now we have tons of them, like to the tune of I think like 12 trillion now around the world of bonds that are actually in full-on negative yield territory even before inflation is presented into the equation. So, a lot of European bonds and places like Switzerland, and there's lots of places that now have negative, Japan's another one, negative yielding bonds. But a bond is basically, when governments issue bonds, they're borrowing against the future productivity, the capital, the labor of their wage slaves, the serfs in their particular geographical landmass. So when the government of Canada issues bonds, they're basically saying, okay, we got all these chattel people, sheeple. They're somewhat productive, and we want to borrow against their productivity. So lend us the money against, just like a farmer. If they went to the market or a bank, they would want to lend money, borrow money from the bank. They'd say, I want to borrow money, and as collateral, I'm going to offer you the future productivity of my ox, or the milk from my cows, or the eggs from my chickens. What government bonds, it's the same idea, except it's all of your productive work, your labor, your capacity to be productive in society, right? That's what the government's borrowing against. Did you give them permission to borrow against your future productivity or your labor or your capital? Of course not. Which is why governments are inherently illegitimate and immoral. But if you think about, even though this is already inherently immoral and corrupt, because nobody has any right to borrow against me, I am the only person that's responsible for my productivity, my labor, my resources, my intellectual capacity, and what the fruits of that productivity, right? But governments think because I live in a particular geographical landmass, central planners, those that use the force of government and mysticism as the pretense of authority, think that they have the capacity to borrow in my name, or in the name of my what I'm leading up to now is not just even against my name, because even though that is already inherently immoral and corrupt to the core, at least for a small time frame in the modern era, at least, people understood, and even governments understood, that it was considered the golden rule. You can fuck with your own generation because they're the ones that are alive and that are the cows that are now producing, right? Or the chickens that are now alive that are producing eggs. You could only bet against their productivity and borrow against their productivity. In the modern world that we live in, and this is in reference to the government of Canada issuing, which is something they'd never done before, these 50-year bonds to the tune of $3.5 billion worth. What governments are doing now, they're not just borrowing against their present wage slaves and serfs. Now, by stretching it out to 50 years, governments now are borrowing against the future productivity, capital, and labor of your kids, and even depending on how quick your generations come to fruition, right? How young you have your children. Now even your grandchildren. 50 years out. 50 years is basically, even in the modern era with longer lifespans, even if you started work at 15, which most people don't, like full-time, like into the productive workforce, they're not 15. The modern era, especially with people that are staying in schools and post-secondary educations, they're not starting to be productive members of society until much, much later in life, 20, 25, sometimes 30 years old. But when governments are issuing bonds on 50 years, they're borrowing 50 years. Like, think about it. Even in the time frame of the old school, like I say, if you started at 15 and you worked 50 years and retired at 65, even then, how many people are buying bonds at 15 years old? Nobody that you know of. You know damn well nobody's buying the people that are buying these bonds are not going to be the ones that will be around to have to pay off the bonds. This is, once again, like I said, back to the gold standard, whereas you can mess with your own generation, but, leave the successive generations alone. They're already going to have to deal with their own bullshit. So that was the golden rule, is you don't pass debts on to future generations because you don't know what else they're going to have to incur, the kind of hardships they're going to have to suffer, right? So you don't pass it on to successive generations. Now, it was bad enough, like I say, I still don't even agree with messing with current generations or born against them when you have no right or authority to do so. No legitimate right or authority to do so. But when you're born on, like I said, to the tune, or printing bonds that'll expire in 50 years, although that's the thing. I mean, even at these interest rates, the people that are buying them, there's nobody that's going to see any return, and the only people that would truly buy a 50-year bond nowadays are central banks, speculators, people that will try to flip and swap that out at a later stage and force that obligation or bullshit onto other people. Because no one, who would want to buy a 50-year bond, even if the government offered you a 2.75 or 2.85% return rate? Inflation already is going to wipe that out completely, right? Already you're going to lose, and that's with even in Canada or the U.S., even in some of these countries that don't, as of yet, haven't crossed into that threshold of negative yields. But in reality, even Canada, the U.S., and the U.K., some of these countries that haven't technically jumped into the negative yield issuance, right, as far as bonds. But if your inflation rate is, 2%, 3%, and your issuance is below that, well, then you're already in negative territory. I tried to explain this to my mother a long, long time ago. And this is when our inflation rates were much, much higher, right? She was getting like 1.8 or 2% of return on these 10-year bonds. But meanwhile, it's like if you took the culmination over that 10 years of what the actual inflation rate was, over the culmination of the entire 10-year period to when the bonds matured, she actually lost money because the reduction of the purchasing power of the dollar through inflation, right? This is the problem, that you're not going to stay ahead of the game no matter how you try to perform that function nowadays, because central planning now and monetary manipulation, it's almost to its end point. It's almost at the end game now. There's no way anymore for anyone to see any genuine returns on their investment. But even outside of that, if you think about it, if a government's issuing 0% or 0.25% or even negative yields, they're saying that the people that they're issuing these bonds about, they're saying they're worth less than zero, basically. They're selling future labor, capital, and resources off at fire sale prices nowadays. So they don't believe that their younger or their successive generations are worth anything at all. And they'll even take a little bit of a loss on their investment to prove that point. Like I say, it just doesn't get any more immoral and inherently illegit than that. If people don't, I mean, like, I understand that people don't understand a lot of these fundamentals because economic illiteracy is rampant. And it's rampant for a reason, because the people that benefit, the benefactors, are those in academia, are those your teachers and the educators and those in, like I say, academia. They don't want to tell you these truths. If they told you these truths, you'd be able to look at them and say, well, what the fuck? They don't want to tell you these truths. And this is why things have come to the, or have come full circle to the point where we're at today, where we are now back to living under complete serfdom. Feudalism, almost, really. Slavery, yes, just by a different term. Democracy. Even if you think about slaves, people will say, oh, well, no, well, they don't steal 100% of your labor, so we're not really full-on slaves. They'll try to find some way to escape that truth, that reality, right? And say, we'll point out the fact that, well, no, when I go to work, I get a paycheck. But people forget that, yes, even though the masters back in the old days that were the true masters and took and didn't pay their slaves an actual living wage, at the same time, though, people have to acknowledge that they still had to pay for the wages, or they still had to pay for all the food for the slaves to eat on a daily basis to keep them productive. They had to keep a roof over their head, right? They had to make sure if they got too sick, if they were productive and they provided enough for the master, they had to at least provide health care in some way to sustain their life so that they could continue to be productive wage slaves for the master. So think about it. In the modern era, take out your housing, like the roof over your head, your energy, which is to keep your house heated so that you sustain your life and you don't freeze in the winter, your food and your belly to keep you be able to be productive when you go to work every day, and at least some small bit of entertainment, a little bit of money left over for a little bit of entertainment. Like I say, even back in the slaves' days, they were given a little bit of entertainment to keep the morale up, right? That's just common sense for any central planner. Yeah, you got to keep morale up if you want your wage slaves and serfs to be productive. So yes, we're afforded lots of distractions and entertainment, but they come at a very hefty price, and the hefty price is your ability to escape from reality and forget about the harshness, the severity, the degrading aspects of living in this modern age of slavery, of serfdom. These 50-year bonds, no government, I mean, even back in the day, like I say, 10-year T-bills or bonds were the big thing back in the day. But they did stretch them out a little bit to 30 years. But even 30 years would still fit in the confines of stealing from your current wage slaves and serfs. Once you stretch it out to 50 years, now you're, like I said, now you're not even talking about stealing from the people that are alive and being productive today. Now you're talking about stealing from the productive labor capacity and capital of future generations that have no skin in the game and had no say into how much of their productive wealth and capacity and labor was stolen from. These people are voiceless. They're the youth. They're the unborn that don't even have any chance to speak up or speak out against this shit. It's inherently immoral and corrupt, people, and it's vitally important that people start taking this into account. Like I say, if you want to confirm what I'm saying, I'll always like to do this so that people realize that I don't just speak out, without having facts to back up what I'm talking about. This is from Canada's the GC.ca, so the government of Canada.ca news release. Now this was back from, actually the archive date isn't present on it, but I'll give you like I say, Actually, when I make this video, I'll try to remember to put this as part of the link in the description so that you can verify it. But I'll tell you right now, so you can do it even right now as I'm speaking in this video. Archived. Canada issues more ultra-long bonds. Archived content. Information identified as archived is provided for reference, research, or record-keeping purposes. It is not subject to the Government of Canada web standards and has not been altered or updated since it was archived. Please contact us to request a format other than those available. Finance Minister Joe Oliver today announced that the Government of Canada successfully issued $1 billion in 50-year bonds. This is in addition to the $2.5 billion in 50-year bonds currently outstanding, which combined is a total of $3.5 billion. The additional issuance of bonds in the ultra-long sector is in line with the commitment the government made in Economic Action Plan 2012 to reallocate short-term bond issuance towards long-term bonds to help reduce refinancing risks and to lock in low funding costs for Canadian taxpayers. So once again, it's all about kicking the can down the road, forcing these current obligations onto future and successive generations. That's what it's all about. Like I say, I'll try to remember to put a link to this description, or to put a link to this in the description of my video. But know this, even if you just put a couple of those search words into Google, this will come up because it's been archived. And it's there. And it will forever remain there. At least as long as people like me are around. Because I make sure that I'm not just trying to help educate and inform you in the here and now. I want to make sure to keep this kind of information relevant and available so that those future or those successive generations have something to hold up and point to when they do finally start speaking out against this kind of oppression, this kind of theft that they've been subjected to before they even knew it existed. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.